Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. My name is Joyce Hunter, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology. I'm excited about today's DevSecOps webinar about analyzing legacy apps for agile development. First, I would like to thank our sponsor, Checkmarks, without whose support we would not be able to have these wonderful informational programs. Now, a little bit about ICIT. The Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology is the nation's leading cybersecurity think tank, providing objective, nonpartisan research, advisory, and education to legislative, commercial, and public sector cybersecurity stakeholders. Our mission is to cultivate a cybersecurity renaissance that will improve the resiliency of our nation's 16 critical infrastructure sectors, defend our democratic institutions, and empower generations of cybersecurity leaders. As a former government executive, it is clear to me the transition to agile development is complex and challenging, especially for legacy programs. Where do you start and what obstacles may exist? Our panelists with deep experience in government will discuss how they have navigated and implemented agile transformation programs in their organizations. They will highlight approaches to assessing program readiness, anticipating and removing obstacles, and ongoing monitoring and measuring of continuous agile improvement. Attendees will earn 1 CPE for attending this educational briefing. To moderate our conversation today, I'm pleased to introduce Nick Sinai. Nick is a senior advisor at Insight Partners, a large venture capital firm investing in software. He's also a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School and former U.S. Deputy CTO in the Obama administration. Nick, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joyce. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about this topic. So let me try and set the stage for today's conversation and give a little bit of background. The last couple decades, we've seen the rise of agile software development, where software is built in smaller chunks with frequent testing and input from the end user. And that's in contrast to waterfall software development, a more linear approach to software project management. It's called waterfall because progress largely flows in one direction, like a waterfall, through phases of design and development, testing, deployment, and maintenance. Agile, in contrast, doesn't presume all the answers up front. In parallel to the rise of Agile has been this idea of DevSecOps, the mashing together of development, security, and operations. DevSecOps, in my mind, is really about promoting a more cohesive collaboration between the development, security, and operations teams as they work towards more continuous integration and delivery of code. So Agile and DevSecOps have really changed the way startups, scale-ups, and really large organizations build and deploy software, getting features into production faster and better meeting the needs of internal and external customers. When done well, it means better product velocity and reducing waste. And here in the federal government, Agile and DevSecOps are hot topics, and we've seen a lot of important activity and investment. In the Department of Defense, for example, we've seen the launch of numerous so-called software factories from Kessel Run to Bespin and Space Camp, and the rise of platforms like Platform One and Black Pearl. The Defense Innovation Board published a really important software study that I would encourage you all to read about the importance of agile software development, but they also warn about agile BS, as they call it, defense organizations using agile terminology but continuing to build waterfall. Federal civilian agencies have similarly been moving to incorporate Agile and DevSecOps in their programs, from the VA to DHS, GSA, and of course, Social Security. But too often, these conversations about Agile and DevSecOps tend to focus on the brand new apps, the brand new environments, rather than modernizing or evolving existing systems. And as many of the listeners know, most of the apps and systems in the federal government, really in any large enterprise, are called legacy. And that's not meant to be pejorative. It's just a fact that many of them have been around, in some cases, for decades. And some of them are on older technologies like mainframes. And there's a significant leadership push from the past administration, from the current administration, from the White House, from agency leadership, from CIOs' offices to transform our software to agile development. But what does that really mean? How can we apply agile to legacy apps? What are the impediments to do so? Which systems should we prioritize and why? So these are some of the questions I'm hoping we're going to tackle this hour, and I'm joined by two fantastic panelists. Kendra Charbonneau is the lead engineer and enterprise agile transformation coach, United States Air Force Business Enterprise Systems. And Rajiv Mathur is the former chief information officer for the Social Security Administration. Rajiv recently joined the Boston Consulting Group, where he's focused on digital transformation, digital identity, and cyber. So to kick off this conversation, I thought we would hear from Kendra first. Kendra, you recently did a fascinating analysis across all of the systems in business enterprise systems inside of the Air Force. I'm wondering if you might take a few minutes to walk us through that analysis.
Sure, thank you. All right, can you see my slides? All right. So my name is Kendra Charbonneau, as he said, and I work to help the organization look at the agile transformation that took place across our organization of business enterprise systems. Just a little background on who we are. Business and Enterprise Systems Directorate supports the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, AFL-CMC, in providing the IT or information technology to deliver the comprehensive IT solutions that support the warfighter. Essentially anything money, material, and manpower systems we have at BES. And that's what we support, is all of that IT infrastructure. So our portfolio executive officer is Mr. Rich Aldridge, and our BES chief engineer is Mr. Toy Robinson. BES is made up of approximately 150 plus legacy systems and a diverse set of technologies. $1.15 billion portfolio of IT systems and approximately 3.3 million users. The programs within BES began trying to implement Agile in 2017. As we were directed, we were asked to start trying to implement Agile, and so the PEO asked that we start some pilot programs. I participated on one of the larger programs within the PEO and worked to implement Agile and ran into significant challenges along the way. In September of 2019, the Agile Services Team was formalized. What we did is we set up an Agile Services Team to help the challenges that the enterprise was facing. Many of our program teams were having difficulty shifting to Agile and were confused or misunderstanding how to do Agile. So what we were trying to figure out is what was causing that lag and why were we having the difficulty transitioning. Mr. Aldridge championed the team, set us up, and we went in looking at the entire portfolio of all these systems who are also owned by different lines of business. So what is unique to our organization is that we have a customer, which is the bill payer, and then we have an end user, which we call the warfighter. The customer is different lines of business that run across logistics. It might be medical systems, it could be civil engineering or geospatial. All of those are different lines of business with different priorities for their systems. What we did is we went together and we formalized a question set and a maturity model for the organization and iteratively matured that process. So this was innovative in one sense, but it's not innovative to industry. Industry has these maturity models out there. They have question sets that generate spider diagrams, but we formalized that for our organization in a vernacular or language that our organization would understand. What we ended up doing was standardizing that data that was captured from the assessments. So I started to look through the assessments that I had of the teams, and as I did that, I started to understand we needed to standardize that so then I could start looking at this using some characteristics and identifying what the key characteristics of the applications that were having difficulty transitioning into Agile development methodology and implementing that DevSecOps using a CI/CD pipeline. So the goal of the assessments when we got started was just to evaluate how programs were implementing Agile and to identify the gaps and blockers. Quickly though, I started to use it to communicate, educate, and shift the Agile mindset. And then it helped teams implement the cornerstones of Agile to enable a sustainable Agile process. What I knew to be true is that if we didn't spend time helping them implement the cornerstones of Agile, then they would start an Agile journey that would be very difficult to sustain over time. My findings were significant in that they varied significantly in the implementation and the interpretation, usually due to 6 key factors. What I also found out, and today, where we're at today, is currently that 90 programs that have been assessed, we have 22% in infancy, which means they haven't even began their Agile journey for one reason or another. There were 46% are in crawl. That means that they have just started Agile and are starting to implement the Agile terminology and the principles and starting to understand it. They're choosing that framework that they want to use and starting to get the training, etc. Walk, we've got 21% in walk. That means that they have established a disciplined approach to Agile and they're looking at different metrics and starting to think about the automation of this, getting into that automated CI/CD. And then we have 11% in run and 0 in fly, which I'll show you more as we go further. This is what the Agile maturity model looked like. Again, nothing innovative in the sense that industry does do this. What I did is I took some objectives and I applied them to each maturity level. The reason I did this and what I found to be valuable here is that I gave teams something tangible and achievable at each level. It allowed them to start putting a disciplined approach to implementing Agile in their teams. It also helped to set our leadership's expectations. So it managed their expectations in that they were asking for metrics from programs that just had not transitioned yet. They simply weren't there. So what we needed to do is give them a mechanism to see what they could expect from teams based on where they were at. Now, the caveat here is that the teams had to be assessed by the Agile Services team, which has been me. So far, as far as assessments go, I'm not the entire team. But I do all of the assessments because I find that it consistently reports out and I can ask the same questions and gather the same data. Now, the other thing is that I can now let leadership know it generates a conversation to ask the right questions of why teams aren't maturing. Where are your blockers and what are you encountering? What we found out was that there were 6 key constraints. So one of the major things is Agile mindset. Agile mindset is the key to the shift. The rest is the lift. So Agile mindset has to take hold in the organization. It has taken us 2 years to really start to shift this organization to Agile and get that mindset started to instill within the culture. They also, our teams want to go back to that waterfall muscle memory. So it's very difficult to get them to shift. And now we're starting to see that shift take place. But here's the key constraints that we ran into. That technical debt that goes, that's just inherent to these legacy systems. Product owner involvement. The product owner is typically owned by our customer, who is the bill payer. They're the ones who pay the bills, and then we have the end user that uses the application, who we also call the warfighter. Contracts. We have many contracts that are put in place right now that were built around waterfall. So waterfall development, as we know, takes a lot longer and oftentimes requires less resources on that sustainment piece. Then we have training. Training was a significant factor. If we didn't have the right training, the appropriate training, or applied the training quickly enough, oftentimes that training got stale or that knowledge got stale. So we knew we had to beef up our training. And then tooling. Agile tooling looks very different, or is very different, with Agile development methodologies and development with applications than our old waterfall tool sets. So in order to provide that collaboration and transparency, we needed to procure that Agile tooling. We also needed that CI/CD pipeline tooling that was required too. And then resources. We knew that resources were a considerable constraint, and resources kind of fell into an additional bucket, a broader term. It was more about funding or environments or skill sets, etc. So that was a larger bucket that was basically the catch-all for anything that didn't fall in the other areas. The other significant finding was the greenfield versus legacy. So you heard Nick talk about the Kessel runs, the BES pens, the platform ones, etc. And what I found, I went into BES pen, which belongs to BES, and that is where they are taking applications and modernizing them or refactoring them. And so it is greenfield development, as we call it, and it is a pipeline or an environment that is set up and built around the concept of Agile. When I went in and assessed all of these programs, I looked at the data afterwards and I realized that every program came out at run, and I couldn't figure out why. So I started really looking at it and balancing it or comparing it to the rest of the data. And what I found was that any program within the BESPEN group did not have waterfall processes to rework. They were getting it from scratch and being able to start from scratch. They had no technical debt because they weren't bringing anything over from the legacy applications. They got their set of user stories and requirements and they built to that. They didn't have an agile mindset to overcome, which was a huge challenge for us and still is. We're still working on it. However, we're seeing progress because the whole environment was built with the intent of doing agile. So we didn't have that challenge. The other thing we didn't have is we didn't have contract changes that were needed or contract modifications. Everything was built to agile. No acquisition activities to resolve. So one of the things we know is our programs at BES are contracted to procure software. So there's acquisition activities that have to take place with that go in line with it. They did not have to handle that in this BESPEN environment. That was all handled by our program management offices that remained on the legacy side. They also had dedicated teams. Now, the key thing here is many of our legacy systems, because they are down, they're just being sustained and maintained, are shared resources across different applications. So when you have that, as we know with Agile, it makes a team more constrained. What I also realized, though, is that none of them were in Fly. Now, Fly is the nirvana. It's using that CI/CD pipeline, continuously delivering and integration, using that end user feedback to mature your product. And you've got the MVP and you've leaned out all that excess waste in your process. Well, they can't get to Fly without that product owner involvement or that end user engagement or the right metrics tooling. And those three things, every team wasn't affected the same, but one of those three things was impacting those teams, which is why they had not made it to run. Now, the other key thing that I found was that Agile and DevSecOps was being used interchangeably. This is something that is debated out in industry, and it's okay. What I found, though, within our agency that impacted me the most was the vernacular needed to be understood. So when teams were saying, hey, we're Agile, we've got it, leadership, we're Agile, our program's fully Agile, what they actually meant to say is they had implemented iterative development, the Agile development piece. They had not done anything else with the DevSecOps piece. So many of our legacy applications that we struggle with is the fact that this code is old, old technology stacks, old Band-Aid solutions, old architectures, things that don't go well with a DevSecOps or CI/CD pipeline. So what we found was that they could do the team's iterative development, but then there was a handoff, and it included handoff to security teams, handoff to independent testing organizations, and also independent to release. So those things we realized weren't happening. Well, what we were finding was our leadership was saying, oh, that team is fully Agile. They've told us they're fully Agile. And then when we went to go look, they were still releasing once every 6 months. So it allowed us to be able to see that there was a disconnect between those two terms, and we needed to clear that up. The next thing we ran into was, what do we do now with all of this information? So we took it to our PEO, Mr. Aldridge, and our chief engineer, Mr. Robinson, and we said, this is what we have. We have a situation where we cannot move quickly because of our technical debt. That was the key characteristic that was driving us or hindering us from going forward with Agile. If you coupled technical debt with any other constraint, it became highly complex and difficult for the programs to shift. So what we knew had to be done was customers, those bill payers, the leadership, senior leader levels, had to provide knowledgeable product owners who were empowered decision makers. They had to be able to be involved. They had to understand what the field user needed, and they had to be empowered to make those decisions. We don't have that on every application right now. Funding to reduce technical debt has to be discussed. Technical debt is going to cost money to address. We've got to look at the cost and the resources needed to do that. We have to manage technical debt and security debt as a priority. So leadership now has to start looking, instead of looking at cost, schedule, and performance, we have to look at things differently. Essentially looking at that technical debt. How is it building or burning down? And the security, which you get when you go into a DevSecOps pipeline, a CI/CD pipeline. Patience to allow these teams to address their technical and other constraints. They have significant constraints there that they have to address, and we need to give them the time to do it. It is very demotivating to our teams to be told you're not quick enough, you're not doing it well, you haven't done it, and they haven't been given the resources and they haven't been given the time to address it. So what's happening is they're rushing, and they're throwing out the goodness of the software engineering discipline that we have built into our processes. They're throwing all that out in the name of Agile, and we've got to prevent that and make sure we maintain that sound software engineering discipline while we're shifting to Agile. We have to establish Agile contracts, and we have to monitor program progress and metrics differently, making end user satisfaction a key indicator for success. Those are the things that we had, that we brought to our leadership, and he's listening and helping to shift our organization. Again, he's got to meet with customers. Customers are going to be the key to this, offering up the resources and the money, and also enabling us to communicate with our end users. Right now, we don't have that mechanism to get that end user satisfaction, and we've got to enable that with our teams. How do we talk to them? Traditionally in the past, that was not something that we did. We didn't talk to the end users because our leadership, the bill payers, the customers at the staff level had different priorities and goals that they needed to meet that was a delta from what that end user wanted. Now we've got to figure out how to bring those two things together and start having those hard discussions. Back over to you, Nick.
Great, thank you, Kendra, for that fascinating analysis. So let me start a panel conversation. And what I'll say to the audience at home here is, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Please feel free to ask questions of Kendra or Rajiv or even myself, and I'll try and work them into our conversation as we go along. So Rajiv, let's start with you. I'm curious about your reaction to Kendra's analysis. And as the former CIO of Social Security Administration, did you have a similar push for Agile? Did you do or commission a study of your apps and systems? And what's the strategic rationale for moving to Agile at Social Security?
Hey Nick, thanks for the question, and good afternoon, everybody. I mean, Kendra, great presentation, and what she laid out was really a full panoply of what organizations need to do. They need to build that case for change. They need to look at their own organization and where they are in the maturity model, and she talked a little bit about that, and really figure out how do you apply the methodology of Agile to your own organization. And we'll talk about that during the course of today, I think, Nick, when we get into it. At SSA, it was a strategic imperative for us to do more, to build more, faster, cheaper software, and do it for the purposes of servicing our customer. Just a little bit about the case for change for us. The Social Security Administration touches the lives of nearly every American, whether it's the birth of a child or the death of a loved one, or whether you're retiring or filing for disability or looking for a Social Security card. Regardless of what kind of transactions you want to do, you deal with the Social Security Administration, and that service is provided through a boatload of frontline employees, 60,000 frontline employees, 15,000 state-run employees in state-run DDSs, and the case for change continues because for earnings and our enumerations business, there's also dealing with thousands of employers to make sure that the earnings records can be matched to your Social Security record and also be used for tax administration, because the SSA is an agent of the IRS when it comes to collecting earnings. So the case for change was very, very obvious to us. For us, it was all about service and how do you deliver more service, better service, faster, not through necessarily through phones and not necessarily through field offices, but really through any way possible. The strategic imperative was we have to find a way to get more self-service, and that was a singular thing that we were trying to do, is to get self-service out the door. We did look at our applications, and we really looked at our analysis was around our lines of business: disability, Title II retirement, the SSI program, and others, enumerations within Social Security, and each of those programs has had a different level of maturity, a different level of where they were in terms of having the need to move to a modern technology sector. And everything did need to, but you couldn't apply the same solutions and the same approaches to all of those programs. So our push to go to Agile, to digitally transform, really started in 2017, started before that as well, but the 2017 IT modernization plan really put a stake in the ground to move us to the next level. We published the plan across these different lines of business that I just mentioned, and it really started getting involved with the business. I think a key part of our success, and we'll talk about this further on in this hour, is the engagement with the business. Kendra talked about it. She looked at her business partners and how are they going to be affected and what do they need to do. We didn't move out until we had buy-in from the business. It's an important part of the Agile mindset. And it's the new software development methodology, new in quotes, I'd say, right? I mean, you talked about it being around for 15, 20 years, but it requires a lean in from the business. It requires a lean in obviously from IT, and it's no longer just throwing things over the transom. I know we've heard this before, you hear about it all over the place, but how do you actually make it happen? You make it happen by specific tactics of not moving out ahead. Just as an example, you don't want to move out ahead, and easy to launch a good mobile app, but you can't do that if you don't have the business customer behind you to distribute the app. You need a distribution channel, as an example. So we did an analysis. Most of our applications were in some form of Java. However, we had a large slew of them that weren't. There were legacy technologies that we had to figure out a way to do something with. And they're in various stages of modernization now. Back to you.
Yeah, that's really great to see two different perspectives from different parts of the organization, and two very different organizations, but two very large organizations that have a whole collection of applications. And you kind of hear the themes of portfolio analysis and partnership with the business or mission owner if you're really going to be successful. Kendra, if I take one thing from your presentation, it's that Agile isn't a silver bullet, and there's a number of impediments and obstacles to work through. So let me be the devil's advocate. We heard from Rajiv about why Agile was important strategically. Why should the Air Force and why should BES care about Agile?
That's a good question. I'll say what the reason why we find it so important is to respond to the need of that warfighter more quickly. What we know today is that with waterfall, it would take sometimes 2-3 years to get something out to that field user. Or sometimes it would on a best case, it would be 6 months for a release. Getting functionality out there, so we would try and cram everything in that we possibly could. The other thing that is so significant is that cybersecurity piece. Cybersecurity attacks are on an all-time high. They're happening rapidly. We have to be positioned to change quickly and address that. And if we continue doing business the way we've been doing business on our applications, then we're going to have a hard time switching and adjusting and addressing these cyber attacks. This setting us up for Agile, getting into an Agile development methodology, getting our teams structured to deliver frequently, allows us to do this more iteratively, mature, switch priorities as needed, and it also keeps the IT from being already old or aged or considered outdated by the time we get it fielded. So it addresses several things there, and I think the most important of all of those is probably the cybersecurity piece.
Yeah, that's great. Rajiv, I want to double click on how you got buy-in from the lines of business. And so I'm curious how you talked about Agile, both with the lines of business as well as with your organization, your IT organization, of which you were the leader of, and then senior management at the senior executives at Social Security. Kind of how did you talk about Agile in that context? Because I got to imagine that most of them don't come from a technical background.
Right. The common theme that the audience may hear today is that this notion of going to Agile is not about technology. It's not just about technology. It's a lot about everything else around technology, including the people, including the leadership, including getting the organizational buy-in that you need. As I mentioned earlier, as Kendra talked about before, the case for change is pretty compelling, okay? And it's compelling across government. The thing I would say is that when you double click down to the next level and you say, okay, Social Security Administration, everyone cares about customer service, wants to make sure we deliver and over deliver for the customer. So what does that mean? Does that mean more call centers, more people in field offices? Does that mean more self-service options? What does that mean? And how do you translate that common element of more service to actually better technology that can be useful to the end user? A key part of building consensus is and was building trust and transparency with the business customers. And it's not easy to do. I mean, the entire process of building trust, building consensus, going back to my earlier comment about, faster alone, further together. I'll give you an example. When we were launching the SSA IT mod plan in 2017, we had a chance to sign on the dotted line. I had a statement in there as from the CIO and had a full plan around that, and release it. But instead of doing that, we wanted to make sure we had business partners for every single one of our domains. And the tagline on the IT mod plan was it's a business and IT journey, not an IT and business journey, but a business and IT journey. We waited for the right folks who we could partner up with, and they were both announced as co-leads, IT and business together. Just a small thing, right? But these things matter because it's no longer just about IT. One of the questions that I got when I first got to SSA was, where does all the money go? What is all the money spent on? And a couple $2 billion on something. And the thing is, it's spent on valuable things that matter. But we had to find a way to explain that in a way that mattered to our customers, our internal customers. So another element of what transparency and trust looks like to build that consensus is to show where the money goes and really crack open the IT books and say, okay, this is where it's going, line of business wise. This is where each of these line items in the budget are going. And this is where it's helping your business. And in some cases, we get feedback that says, yeah, I don't know what that is. I know you guys are working on it, but I don't know what that is. Well, then we shouldn't work on it. Those are really important things that need to be done to build that level of transparency. I got direct feedback from my business customers that those were things that were important to them, that they better understood where the money went, for example, and what we were working on. A third area of consensus is that, in building consensus, is that in Agile, it requires that lean in that I mentioned, and business has to be at the table. And so they were at the table. Decisions weren't made unless they were at the table. When we're talking about dev teams, a product manager, who's an important part of the whole Agile process, they work for the business, not for IT. We started off with them working for IT, but that function needs to be a business function, and that is the key representative of the business at the table, giving direction to the IT service provider. That's what we were. So these are institutional things that you got to do across the enterprise, and then you got to do it again and again and again. And every time you're at a point of decision that you have a chance to go one direction or another, the easy direction or the harder direction. Sometimes the harder direction is to make sure you're there with the business partner, continuing together. So that's a couple of examples of building consensus. It's never easy. It's never easy. Got to put the ego aside, and you got to figure out a way to make it work. You won't get what you want, but at the same time, over the long haul, it'll be better for all involved, including the agency and at the end, the customer.
Those are some really great examples about building consensus through mutual understanding and trust and transparency. Kendra, the Air Force has arguably been leading the way in Agile and DevSecOps inside the Department of Defense, right? We have Platform One and Cloud One and all these software factories. The Air Force Chief of Staff recently visited Kessel Run, has been talking about a pace of change where the Air Force needs to get to. And how does that translate to the Program Executive Office level? And it sounded like you had senior leadership buy-in at your PEO and the senior technical leadership, but does that, how did you continue to build consensus within your BES Program Executive Office?
So interesting that you asked that. There's two facets to that question. One is Mr. Aldridge, our PEO, heard the message loud and clear and agreed with it. He understands exactly why we need to do this, and therefore he championed it across our organization. And that is critical to getting it going and making people accountable. To know that leader is involved and cares and wants to do it is pivotal to the organization doing that agile transformation. However, he also heard the message that we want this, but it costs money and resources. And he knows we've got to have these hard conversations with our bill payer customer to say to them, how are we going to pay for this? You want this, but we've got to pay for it. For years, we have ignored our technical debt. That has been a lower priority than getting functionality or capability out to that end user. So because of that, now we're in a situation where it's a pay me now situation. It's a pay me now, pay me later, but we've got to pay our debt now to be able to do what they want to do, which is to move faster. So the conversation still has to be had, and he understands that. Now, translating it down to the rest of the teams, I think that it was translated down to them. However, what happened with our teams was we didn't know what we didn't know at that point in time. So when we got into it and started, we noticed that some lines of business, some of the portfolios that were, for instance, civil engineering, or for instance, logistics and supply, they had more knowledgeable resources that were able to implement this. They had the product owner involvement, etc. So that took place, but it took place on different levels, just like Rajiv was saying. I think that most of all, though, there were so many resources out there that simply didn't understand what this meant. They didn't understand what it meant to go faster with Agile. It seemed silly to a lot of them, honestly, because they had only known waterfall development. That's what we've done for years. But what I also came to understand as I went through and did this analysis, it seemed that way. It was difficult, but it was also very frustrating for these teams because they wanted to do what Mr. Aldridge and our senior leaders in our government was asking. However, they just haven't been armed with the proper resources, tooling, money, etc., to do it. So it was frustrating. But I think what we know is it won't happen overnight. We know what we've got now, and we know what Mr. Aldridge needs to do at this point to start having those hard discussions about funding and money to make it happen.
One of the things that Kendra's analysis identified was the talent question. And Rajiv, I'm wondering how you thought about that. Did you bring in Agile coaching or Agile training? And did the executives need training in this? What kind of organizational changes did you have to make?
Yeah, let me take that question in a second. If I could just quickly go back to the consensus question, I just want to make one more point that, with consensus and consensus across the agency and across business and IT, there's no doubt that everyone's heart is in the right place. There's no doubt that everyone wants to do the right thing. And once you recognize that and you figure out how do you come to common ground, that has to be kind of point number one. I want to make sure I said that because I had great partners at the SSA when it came to that, great partners within IT who helped in that regard. And you can't do it. Can't do it alone, and you can't do it unless you have that sort of partnership, that sort of dialogue. And Commissioner Saul, who's the head of the SSA, or is the head of the SSA, really set an example by making sure that we had a dialogue amongst the senior-most folks where we could go to each other and we could make sure that we were kind of on the same page. And setting that example was important. I think that needs to start from the top. To your talent question, probably the most exciting part, I think, of transformation. Probably the most exciting part. I think you and I, Nick, have talked about this before. We in 2018 we started a project, and it was a project at the time. It became a lot more than that, called the IT workforce strategy. And so you mentioned, a number of things that could be done when it comes to training and coaching. We wanted to look at the employee life cycle and the journey of the employee. And you can't serve the customer if you don't have employees that aren't happy, and you can't do it if they're not well trained and well skilled. So this IT workforce strategy looked across a number of different areas. It looked certainly across talent management, what skills we currently have, where the skill gaps were. We looked at culture and leadership. How are we interacting with each other? Leadership at the executive level was an important part for me. Digital workplace, do we have the right tools that our employees could work on? Not just IT employees, right? When you're working in a cross-functional team and you're working in a group of 7 to 10 of an agile team, you got to be able to communicate, especially in COVID world, right? You got to be able to communicate with them seamlessly. So that digital workplace was important. Collaboration was important in that case. Communication, having consistent messaging. When Kendra mentioned this, why is it happening? Why are we doing this? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to me personally, to my job and my role and my organization? These are all really important parts of transformation and moving the needle a little bit forward every single time, right? And then finally, sourcing. Sourcing was the fifth element of that IT workforce strategy. Is how do we bring a different skill mix that we can then start developing? It's my belief that you can't have people kind of swoop in into an agency, especially a strong culture that most government agencies have, and kind of do their own thing. You got to kind of eat their food, and you got to drink the water, and you got to partner up. And so bringing somebody in from the outside, partnering them up with somebody from the inside is really important. And I always said internally, cool kids on the block, not cool kids in the block. We don't want those two groups. Everyone's a cool kid, and everyone needs to be a cool kid. So you can't have one or the other. It sounds cliche and hard to do. Wasn't always successful, but certainly very important to be able to do that. Let me talk a little bit about the skills assessment, if I could. The skills assessment part, we looked at we used to do it every 2 years. We made it into every year. Looked at what are our critical skill gaps, and when we hired every year, we hired across these key priority areas, and it was important for us that we sourced appropriately. Partnered up with colleges. We started doing college recruiting for the first time in 7 or 8 years, and brought in experienced hires where needed. So all very important part of talent management and making sure we had the right skills. Yes, we had coaching. Yes, we had training. We had training for team members that was mandatory. Had training available, product management training for executives, for the executive team across the agency. Some took it, some didn't. More are taking it now. Wasn't mandatory, but these are all important parts of that whole transformation process. Again, all depends on where you are in the maturity, right? And how much of this you apply, how much of all of these little tactics you apply to your particular situation.
I see Kendra nodding her head as you were talking through some of those strategies to upskill and attract talent and make sure there weren't two cultures of cool kids versus not cool kids, and all of those kinds of things. Kendra, so you identified training as a impediment to the agile transformation inside of BES. What are you guys doing now to address that?
So one of the things BES has done is they have procured training contracts. So we've got industry partners coming in and training our enterprise of people. We also have obtained tooling, Udemy access for our folks to get Agile training there. We've gotten some of the application or the program teams have procured their own training internally. So what we're doing is trying to address role-based training, tool training, as well as Agile training, and then different methodologies of that training. Then once they get that and the program team is starting that journey, we bring in or we'll provide coaches where they need coaching to help those teams. One of the things I thought Rajiv said that was so important is getting that customer or that business line owner involved so that they understand where they contribute and how they contribute. I have found that so many of our applications within BES have provided us a product owner, but the product owner isn't empowered to make some of these decisions. And what I'm finding is oftentimes that customer, that high-level executive decision maker, is still doing things in a waterfall fashion. They're handing off, this is what we want, we're giving you the money, and we come back and report on progress over time. But not fully understanding what that means if we're going agile, what their buy-in has to be, and that communication. So the other thing that I think is key that you pointed on is there are no cool kids. That means that we don't leave anybody out to be able to talk and openly discuss. You know, we have end users who want to be heard, and they need to be heard, and it needs to be brought to that customer, that bill payer, their attention when you see a delta between what the customer needs and what that end user wants. So all of that, as he's saying, is it plays into this transformation, and the roles change, and how we did business completely changes. And so a training goes along. We've been getting product owner training, but we don't own the product owner. So we are paid and put on contract to maintain these IT systems for our business partners. So our structure is a little bit different than Rajiv's, and so our challenges are a little different as well. And so our PEO has to go to those customers and say, please empower your product owners. Give me empowered, knowledgeable product owners that are listening to those field users.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess you can't say we're not going to build or maintain that system for you. Right? That's part of your mission is to support the various parts of the Air Force, regardless of how much they are buying into product ownership culture, and regardless of how much they are seeking that end user feedback. I think that's a really important point. Just want to play on that for a sec. Is this idea of really understanding what end users, whether it's a Social Security beneficiary or whether it's an airman, warfighter, is really understanding what it's like for the user, whether you're asking them, whether you're observing them, whether you're finding other ways to understand their behavior. Because one of the challenges we have is the most senior person in the business or mission making product decisions based on their gut or considerable experience, but that may be different from what the actual user need is. And that's something that I know that there's a number of organizations, including the U.S. Digital Service and the Technology Transformation Service in the federal civilian side, have been talking a lot about. We're running short on time, so I want to keep the conversation going. Let's talk about tooling. Rajiv, did you have to invest in new tooling for Agile and DevSecOps?
You know, some of it we had already when we looked at tooling, when we needed to scale up the tooling. Some of it was policy that required the use of tools because the tools were already there. One example I would use is we had a tool that we built on was a COTS system, but we built some additional applications on top of it. Again, was to track. I mentioned to you about where does all that money go. And that was really important for us to be able to show how every team is working. what they're working on, what the outputs are, what the cadence of the output is, when software releases are happening, who's working on them, etc. And so tracking all of that was a requirement, and requirement at for every team, and including into the executive ranks. If you're spending time on it, you put it in that tool. We also use Jira. We also use a number of the other standard off-the-shelf stuff. But this was an important part of us providing that level of transparency when it came to teams, and it came to how the work was being done.
Yeah, from an insight perspective, from a venture capital perspective, the incumbent vendors oftentimes are not the ones that are creating the best-in-class new tools, and so those are tremendous opportunities to invest in the next generation of great software development and continuous integration, continuous deployment, all kinds of security scanning, static code analysis, tooling that have this opportunity to build the next great category. And that's kind of, we've invested in a number of those companies, Checkmarks included. Kendra, I'd be interested in your perspective about tooling, and because you had those different customers, those different parts of the Air Force that you're building systems for, are you able to standardize tooling at all?
So we're working toward that right now. Part of my Agile assessment, because as I mentioned, they had started kind of piloting this for 2 years before we got to this point. What part of the assessment was finding out what tooling they had started using. Some of the programs had gone out and procured their own. Some of their customers had driven them to use certain tooling, and then most had no tooling at all. So what we did is we did a little bit of analysis of alternatives, looking at some industry COTS tools, and made a decision of what tool set we would like to use. And then we started talking, we procured a set to standardize. What I've come to realize as we've gone into it is we also need to take a step further, and we need to standardize the configuration of those tools when you're implementing them for teams, so that we get a standard approach, making sure that the sound software engineering discipline is still inherent to that tooling and process. When you're talking about project management tooling, you want to make sure that you've got that traceability built into the code, that you have the technical, testing, and you've got the documentation automated. So that tool set should enable agility, right? And then you go into that pipeline and have all of that integrated with it. That gives you that continuous integration and deployment or development, delivery. What we want to do, though, is standardize that. However, the question is, how do we pay for that? How do we fund that, and how do we sustain it and maintain it? Because that takes another set of resources that we don't have today. So we're still working through that. We found that challenge. We've brought it back to Mr. Aldridge and our senior leadership. Mr. Robinson has been helping us sift through that, but it is definitely a challenge that we've got to try and overcome. It's significant. How do you get different customers to buy into using these tools, and how do you get them to pay for it? And the budget just isn't there. They just don't have the budget for it right now.
That's a great point about not just standardized or more standardized tooling, but also more standardized configurations and how you actually use the tools. Rajiv, let's pivot a little bit and talk about security. Kendra had talked about it a little bit earlier. How did you ensure that security was integrated and not just an afterthought here?
That's first and foremost an important part of when you're recrafting how you're going to build technology differently. Got to make sure security is right there at the beginning. And part of our approach was to make sure that we had dedicated folks that were working on the various projects that were going on. This was really across the board, not just security, but I'll make the point that part of success when you're doing Agile, when you're trying to move faster, is to make sure that you have a singular focus on what it is that you're trying to do, and not spread out across multiple functions, multiple teams. And that's, I think that was an important part of success for us. And security was one of them. We looked at part of where you start is, do you have certain projects, certain profiles where you might be further along in the ATO process? and it's more of a bunny hop to get to the end versus starting from scratch. Are there things that we can do that can inherit parts of those controls within the ATO process to allow us to move faster? These are all based on data, based on some judgment that allowed us to go a little bit faster based on whatever the project might be. In some cases, you can avoid doing the full scope of what you may need to do when it comes to security authorizations. But there is a way to go faster, and the question is, how do you align your folks when it comes, and how do you choose the right projects to go faster and not start from scratch every time?
Yeah, in my mind, it means thinking about security from the beginning. It means integrating it throughout. It means not having security accreditation processes that are kind of these big bang 1,000-page PDFs that and I know that's just a lot of the way security accreditation works. But the more it can become more of a continuous process, I think the better off we're all going to be. Kendra, how do you think about security?
So really quick, I just want to say security we know is going to be a challenge for us. If we can get those pipelines accredited, we build trust into the process. We standardize that process, not the agile development so much, because you can't there. But if we build trust into how the programs are doing their process, making sure that we have proper documentation, proper scanning at the right point, the gates that keep the product from promoting unless it meets certain criteria. If we can do that and we can resolve some of our technical debt that equates to security risk, then we can shift and start moving more quickly and refactoring or addressing our security debt as we go along. But it has to be built into that pipeline. You build that trust in and address it that way. I agree with Rajiv that there are going to be some that are easier to get there than others because they have already done some of that important work up front. The problem we have with so many of our legacy applications right now is that it has not been a priority for them to address some of these things unless it was just in their face.
Let me ask you about that, Kendra. You said security debt and technical debt. How do you convince people that that's important? Because if you ask people, whether they're executives, your business partners, or end users, they're always going to say that features are the most important thing. They want the functionality. They kind of assume that you're investing in your platform and your own capability to deliver software. So how do you make the case that you need to invest in technical debt and security debt?
Well, I think that this is a perfect example. You want us to go agile and deliver something quicker to your end user. However, we can't go quicker without making it worse, possibly. I mean, that's always an issue. So if you'll let us deal with this, and we'll never be rid of technical debt, but if we can hit those big items that are keeping us from going quickly, then we can start giving you that functionality much more quickly, and we can change priorities. We can give them to you more frequently, maybe even monthly, maybe even every week. It doesn't matter, but we'll be able to adjust. Right now, we cannot give the field user what they want as quickly as they want it. So if we can get ourselves positioned to do that, then it's a win for all of us. And technical debt.
We have time for. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. I was going to say technical debt has to be resolved. So we have to start addressing that and the security issues, and that's how they'll get that functionality quick.
Great. We have time for one more question each. So Rajiv, can you talk to us a little bit about metrics? Kind of how did you, what did you measure and what did you report out on inside your organization?
Lots of different ways to look at your level of transformation, certainly. One method was, of course, looking at what percentage of overall dev efforts were agile. And I'll tell you that I think we started probably in the 20s or 30% range, and we're probably now at about 70% of all our dev effort is agile. Looking at, I mentioned about dedicated people, folks on teams. We had a situation and continue to have a situation where there were folks that were spread out across 4 or 5 different efforts at the same time. There's no way that you can make headway when that kind of thing, when that kind of situation is happening. So how do you track that? How do you first figure out that that's actually happening, and then make sure that you can reallocate and reprioritize folks' time? It means making choices, and that is something we did. So that two very simple examples of things that we did. Of course, there's the typical things about how quickly were we releasing software. I mean, for the disability case processing system, for example, that's out in 40 plus states now. We were dropping code every month, as an example, which is great. That was definitely a pathfinder. So there are many ways to do that. Depends on your maturity, and those metrics will change as you go through as you go through your own maturity.
Great. And Kendra, you have the final question here. What are some of the biggest myths about Agile and DevSecOps, and what myths do you want to slay today?
So I think the biggest one for me was no one is a unicorn. Agile can work for all programs, however you apply it where it makes sense. So you have to use some thought process and strategic thinking to it. Continuous delivery is critical to addressing this war on cybersecurity. We've got to be able to get there where we can quickly address it and rectify issues that are found or vulnerabilities. DevSecOps or DevOps does not equal continuous integration and continuous delivery. We have to make sure that everybody understands what those mean and how that works. And saying you're doing it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it. So trust but verify, really look at it. You mentioned that Agile BS, really understand what to look for and know whether you're seeing Agile or not, seeing the right processes and practices. And then tools don't make you Agile. Understanding that just having those Agile tools does not make the program Agile, and that also they have to be set up correctly and be implemented correctly so that the teams maintain that software engineering discipline that should be there. Those are the biggest myths I would probably try and debunk.
Great. Well, thank you to all of the participants listening and watching today. A huge thank you to Kendra and Rajiv. Thank you to Eyesight and DLT and Checkmarks and for hosting us. So back over to you, Joyce.
Thank you very much. This was a great conversation. I appreciate the time that Kendra and Rajiv took out of their busy schedules to come and talk with us today. There were a couple of questions, Kendra, about getting copies of your slides. Would that be possible?
I believe so. I just need to clear it with our organization, and then I can hand them off.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to Checkmark. Thank you, Nick, for being the excellent moderator that you always are. And we look forward to seeing you at our next seminar, our next webinar. Just want to make sure that you know that our spring briefing is coming up on March 18th. So look on our website, icitech.org, and sign up for our spring briefing. Thank you very much. Have a good day and live long and prosper.